All right, excellent. Let's get started. Good afternoon. My name is Nabeel Nizar. I run the solutions engineering team at Saviynt. Thank you. I know you had a lot of choices of master classes. I'm glad you picked this one. I only have about 95 slides to go through, so buckle up. No, I promise, it won't be death by PowerPoint. We're going to show you some really cool stuff as well, right? And if you do get a chance, if you want a more deeper custom demo that you want done, please stop by our booth. We are giving away helicopters for your kids, right? It is a kid-friendly event, so stop on by. All right, so we're going to talk about improving end-user experience with bringing intelligence into your identity governance platform. And how many of you, show of hands, know what identity governance and administration is? Oh, very good. Okay. So at a very high level, you guys are here for the Cloud Identity Summit. It's all about identity, right? But in reality, it's really about the access that the identity possesses down to your applications that really brings that end user experience together. And what you're seeing over the course of a few years is the explosion of SaaS, the whole digitalization effort that's been going on. Everyone's got this cloud-first strategy, and everyone's focused on single sign-on into the SaaS applications. So you know all the vendors from an identity perspective, helping you extend your on-prem into the cloud. What's missing is that same level of scrutiny or visibility into what a user can do and what they have access to in terms of governance. That is what we at Saviynt are doing in terms of identity governance in the cloud. The second aspect of this is you really want to improve that end user experience, because it's not about who has access, what they have access to, how they got it, and why. It's more about how they're using that access that helps drive your whole identity governance administration practice. So your auditors don't really want to know if you have access to Salesforce. They want to know what you can do within Salesforce. So that deep level of access privileges are what needs to be brought up, and controls put around it from a policy perspective and governed. So simple things as changing how single sign-on works for your organization could have an impact as to how many people are now getting access to the application. So that's the aspect that you want to govern. At Saviynt, in order for us to bring intelligence into that identity governance process, we have to go beyond just looking at the application and the entitlements. Our focus is because business today have several different ways of providing that access. You've got ITSM tools like Remedy, ServiceNow being that front end for people requesting access, so you want to be able to audit that. And you've got SIM solutions for years that have been collecting all those logs, but have a tough time bringing that logs up into a governance solution to show what a user is doing with that application as well. So herein lies that problem, right? So you know that intelligence, all the artifacts for intelligence exist. It's about bringing it all together to make that user experience for IGA much more palatable to the end user. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the users. It's not just about the Joe user requesting access, but it's the compliance owner that wants to know what level of access, who certified that access. It's the risk officer that wants to know the overall risk of the individual having access as well. So in order to do that, what we've done at Saviynt is brought in the concept of the identity and security warehouse. So it's not just an identity concept, it's also bringing in the application logs and then running machine AI on the back end of it with analytics to basically come up with all the algorithms to show how an individual is using that particular access. One of the most simple things that we've been doing around this is the concept of peer groups. Now, if you're familiar with security analytics, that concept of peer groups has made its way over into the identity analytics platform as well. So it's not just about a title of a manager getting access to an application, but it's looking at various attributes of an individual's profile to go figure out who else, like that individual, has access to a target application, and then quickly coming back and helping you with a Netflix-style recommendations for the inlier, and also, more importantly, from an outlier perspective, showing you what excessive access an individual has. A very simple example of this is Identity Management 101. Now, if you guys follow along, and we've all done this, right? You've got an HR system, and you've got a target system, and you're trying to figure out how a user needs to be provisioned into that. IDM or the governance 101 is all about the connector and transporting that data from one end to the other. The problem is no one in HR knows what job code 12345 really maps to in terms of access to an application. And if you go ask the app owner, they don't know how people get access to their application based on their job functionality. So as you sit through implementations, you've got the business analysts doing requirements gathering, which involves all the stakeholders, and you've got months and months trying to develop what that policy should look like. And at the end of the day, the app owner says, well, let's create a profile that looks just like Joe. And Joe's been in that organization for 15 years, and Joe's accumulated a whole bunch of access, and that now becomes the default template for how a provisioning policy should be granted. That shouldn't work either, right? And if you take a different approach of an access request, where the whole notion of bringing up a catalog of all the entitlements and serving that up to the business raises the red flags of, I don't want my users requesting anything either. I don't want to show them everything that they can request. So therein lies the solution that a lot of vendors put out there, which is you can protect that through RBAC. And that's when you guys all sit back and go, really? I have to do roles first in order to do a provisioning solution or a governance solution, and there's the complexity, right? So all this intelligence that we're providing from analytics purpose actually helps everything from access request to lifecycle management to role governance to certification and all the other different functions of an IGA solution. So as an example, what we're doing here is instead of going down the path of developing those static roles, we're trying to get more dynamic by looking at that, the outliers, trying to figure out who you need to focus on from a risk perspective rather than coming back and saying everyone with a title of CFO should get access to the folder with 10K filings. Let's now get a little bit deeper and try to figure out what their actual profile looks like, and so that peers similar to them can also share that access as well, right? And all of this is auditable as well. So static, you've got the definition of access based on criticality. From a dynamic perspective, you've got more of the outlier or the inlier peer analysis. And then you can start getting into the future state, which is really bringing in things like behavior analytics to really improve that end user experience. So yes, while a person with a title of CFO should have access to the 10K folder, if they open and close that file about 50 times in under 5 minutes, you should be concerned that you've got some sort of policy violation, or they're probably sitting there taking a picture with their cell phone on a personal network that most CASBs still can't solve, right? It's the end user problem that you're trying to solve. So let's show you how this all sort of plays out. Come on. I lost my screen, so bear with me. How do I get to... Killing PowerPoint always works. All right. So from a request perspective, and please don't tell me I lost all my internet. Okay. All right. So all the functions of an IGA solution. We're looking at access request at this point, right? So if I simply go down and say I'd like to request access for an individual, which is what traditionally your end users are going to do from a self-service perspective, request on behalf of, or a manager self-service. A request we're going to tether here. Someone's sabotaging the CIS network on me. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. All right. Come on. This better work, otherwise we're going back to the 95 slides. All right. Do you have wireless there, Sam? Okay. No Wi-Fi? Okay. I've got no bars on my cell phone either. That's the problem. Okay, let's try it one more time. All right. Okay, we're back to requesting of access. All right, so I'm going to find an individual. And let's go with Chris here, who is requesting access. And so now you've got this whole concept of dynamic rules. So we're creating a peer group of Chris based on his title, his department, his manager, his location, and showing him a catalog of entitlements that he can request. Now, if he decides he's going to go down and let's say he picks an application that is front-ended by Okta. So you've got the cloud identity concept, you've got an Okta application, you request access to the application. All right? And now you have the concept of recommendations. So I'm telling you, based on that peer group, what other users have similar access, and you can request them all in one spot, right? And so now, as you mine this data, as those requests are happening, the other added bonus of this is, if it's people with a similar peer group requesting all similar access, I can go make a suggestion to the manager or the business owner of a role that they can come back and do a role engineering process on. So what we're doing in this process is actually helping you provide that role mining data from an analytics perspective that can help you in that automation of role engineering as you go create it. So let's say you continue down with the application and you're picking Okta as the application. Now you know the next step of this is going to be, well, what do you want to do within the application? And therein lies the problem because the end users don't know, right? Now you've got situations of acronym or an entitlement that you don't know which one to pick. So you decide you're going to do the same thing that every end user does, which is add them all, let the approver go figure it out, right? It's always about people, process, protocol, folks, and all we're doing is the protocols to help you with that process that isn't quite defined when you're embarking on IGA strategy. So now we've got the analytics engine that runs on the back end that comes back and says, people in your peer group do not have access to this particular entitlement. I'm going to give you a negative vote of confidence for you, still allowing you to put in that exception, which will still route it to the approver, but now I have the governance to back up with the intelligence that comes back and says, the governance tool said you shouldn't have this access, and if you approve it, you're taking on that liability from a risk perspective. Now I can increase the individual score, but also show that this particular access is going to become an outlier for that individual. Okay? For everything else, if you've classified that entitlement as low risk, it is not a SOX critical application. And I can also help you with that business process by auto-approving this as well. Again, all configurable. You don't have to go down this path, but you'll start seeing where those requests that map up to that peer group calculation that says it is low risk, but this individual should have it based on his peer. I can now eliminate that next step of requesting or getting that approval from a manager before you grant access to that before you get access to that application. Very similarly, when you then come back and start doing certifications if you will. How many of you run certification campaigns where you get no revocations of access and everything is a rubber stamp of approval? No one, right? Awesome. Yes, that's the problem that compliance faces. A lot of times, there's this notion that compliance does not equal security. You're absolutely correct, because you're not providing any intelligence back to the certifier how the individual is using that access as well. So now we've got this concept of bringing in that usage data. So I can tell you, if you're going to certify your 5 direct reports, Joe does not ever log into Salesforce.com. I can now highlight that as a potential risk so that you can take the necessary action on it rather than doing a blanket select all, approve all. So if these are all your direct reports that you have to certify, if I go through the next step of then going through each individual application to certify access, and we've got Wi-Fi. Come on, CIS. Don't fail me now. So now you have analytics for your certification campaign where I can come back and highlight every detail around that intelligence I can provide that certification campaign. So for example, I have an individual that we found 9 segregation of duties during a certification campaign that is front and center for that certifier. I can dig into these SOD risks, and now I'll take you through the whole process of mitigating that SOD as well. And we'll talk about how we bring intelligence to that SOD process in a minute. But now you've got that intelligence back to that end user that says less than 20% of users in this peer group have access to this entitlement. By doing a select all, approve all, you're increasing that risk of access for that particular individual. But also, as I mentioned, we're bringing that request history. And that request history could be in an ITSM tool. So if you wanted to go back and dig through why and how of the user access, you now have that auditable information right front and center as you're doing a certification campaign of the audit trail for that individual getting access. But it's not just about the request process, and it's not just about the certification process. Those are the most widely used components of an IGA solution, but there's a lot more in between, right? So now you've got the concept of trying to do roles, for example. The toughest problem with embarking on a roles project is ownership and quality. Business is ever changing, your roles are ever changing. If you don't keep tabs on that role itself, it's going to go stale very quickly. And so now you have the capability to come back and use the data that you've been mining to then provide recommendations to role owners to say, these 5 people who are members of your role are also requesting a particular SharePoint site, and they're requesting access as a contributor for that site. I can now make a recommendation back to the role owner to go ahead and add that entitlement in their role constraint. On the flip side, on that analysis, I can also come back and look at usage data and apply that to the entitlements in that role constraint. So for example, if there's a SharePoint site that nobody logs into, I can now flag that as an outlier in that role constraint and advise the role owner, or the app owner, the business owner of that role to then remove that entitlement as well. So a lot of those capabilities also go hand in hand with segregation of duties. So as you can see, there's recommendations we can make on unused entitlements that people have access to that we're not able to get any usage data. And this usage data does not have to come directly from the application. If you're sending this to any of your favorite SIM tools, we can pull it in from that as well. But the things like Splunk and QRadar and the logarithms, you can pull that data directly into our platform to then run that analysis against that data. Now, if you look at segregation of duties, one of the key things to point out here from our perspective is that we're not just looking at IGA in the traditional sense that of app roles and entitlements, but we look at it as application GRC. So what we're doing is bringing access control at that fine-grained level into our tool. So now, not only can I tell you that Joe has access to a particular SAP role or an Oracle EBS responsibility, but I can go right down to the T codes or the menus and functions within EBS and give you that fine-grained detail of whether the individual is using that entitlement, which is how you start then being able to look at analytics and apply them to the SOD within your enterprise. And you'll see on the right-hand side the concept of potential risk versus actual risk. And the actual risk is where we now have that usage data to come back and tell the individual that these are the SODs that you should be focusing on first versus the ones that are low priority because they're potential. We haven't seen them executing any of the transactions with that access that they've gained based on that segregation of duties as well, okay? But it's as we mentioned, it's not just about those IGA functions, it's also about lifecycle management and how we can help you in that whole automation of the provisioning policies. So for example, everyone's heard of roles, everyone's heard of these provisioning connectors and policies that you've been doing in IGA. Here's our approach to doing this. So we've onboarded 2 applications. And the concept really here is about app onboarding. So as we bring the applications on board, I've created a rule for SAP here that says, go out and find me everyone in the SAP application. And I would like to fire off a rule that says, just look at cost center as a primary attribute or and the job code description as a secondary attribute. And go find me everybody that fits that profile. So as it goes through and brings that up into the workbench, you now have the ability to use this workbench and bring all that analytics data to further refine how you're going to create those peer groups, how you're going to create those provisioning policies. So for example, I'll come back and say, I want to focus on job code 1567, which has a job code description of tax, and a specific entitlement for that end user or that authorization that is the visibility into the general ledger display in the finance application. It's hit 995 people that have one of those 3 attributes. And then it goes through and says with 100% confidence that there's 3 people that match up to that rule. I can quickly look at it, verify that they are the users that have those entitlements, and approve this rule, which now becomes part of that that recommendations, the inlier, if you will. Now, if a 4th person joined the company and they matched all those different attributes from HR perspective, I can now suggest this particular access that they can request from that dynamic role concept. But also, what's more important is that as I approve this, I can then be able to go back and provide my organization with those provisioning policies that otherwise you're doing from scratch. So now I've helped you with developing and creating and implementing your provisioning and lifecycle management policies as well. Okay? So we're continuing down the analytics path. What good is analytics if it's only going to help your IGA functions, your business owners? It's also got to help you as IT to help provide the value that the IGA solution is providing back to the business as well. So now you have the ability to come back and run analytics against the data that's in the warehouse. How many identities do I have? How many invalid managers, privileged accounts, orphaned accounts by application? So now you have all of these metrics that are going to help you from a business perspective. These are going to go to your auditors, right? These are the controls that your auditors are looking for. External audit isn't looking for a compliance report, right? That's the last thing they're looking for. What they're looking for is the fact that you have controls in place to govern the access in the first place. So these are the controls that you can then run in a continuous compliance fashion within your ecosystem to then be able to produce reports that talk about service accounts, orphaned accounts, accounts with inactive users that have active accounts per application, all right? So these are the types of intelligence that you can then provide your IT auditors as well. One of the things that's also important is, how can I help my business? As it times out on me. Everything that could go wrong in my demo has gone wrong, just to put that out there, right? All right, dashboard. Okay. So now, from a request perspective, you've got governance solutions that are not going to go out and automate every lifecycle management use case for every application. There's going to be more applications that you're focused on from a SOX criticality or HIPAA, Basel, insert your favorite regulatory compliance there. So there's going to be a lot of disconnected apps. Of those disconnected apps, you are going to do a ITSM fulfillment or a manual swivel chair fulfillment. So you can now go through and figure out how long it takes to get access to those manual applications, provide an SLA back to the business of, this is how long we're going to guarantee it's going to take to get access to that system. And you can always tell the business, if you want to throttle that back down and you want to give it in a 0-day start fashion, now you have these KPIs that you can go back to your business to request funding for the next phase of your governance project, right? Because as we all know, you'll start on a phase 1, you go on a phase 2, and then you lack the funding to continue, and the business doesn't see the value of what IGA is providing your organization. So now you can also leverage these analytics to help that cause. So whether it's the type of requests that are coming in, how many of those are firefighter requests, how many of those are exception-based requests, where do I need to go modify my process to help me get better at this whole governance as well. Very similar, you can start looking at analytics for certification. You want to find out the biggest problems in a certification campaign, folks, is invalid managers or owners of roles that don't exist in the organization as well, and you haven't been able to backfill them or update that metadata in your warehouse. But it's also the ones that come back and do a quick select all, approve all. So now you can run these analytics to figure out who's doing those select all, approve alls, who are the fastest approvers in the organization. It's not to out them, but it's to figure out how I can better change that end user experience to make them not go through that fatigue or the mundane process, but actually make it much more intelligent. Maybe changing the certification campaign, maybe then coming back and doing a micro certification where they pay a little bit more attention to what they're certifying as well. So you'll have all the analytics around it, whether they're orphaned accounts, users per business unit. When you start getting into segregation of duties, again, the analytics that you can then provide your organization will be wrapped around how many SODs exist in the organization today, how many mitigating controls have I been applying across the space, and this is another example of how we can then provide those, the analytical engine provides those features back to the business as well. Staying with analytics and the controls that we talked about, it's great that IGA solutions today can find you orphaned accounts. I think that's phenomenal, right? The fact that you look at an identity and look at accounts, you unify them, and whoever is left behind are the orphaned accounts. But that's great, because you provide that report to the IT auditor, and the IT auditor says, that's awesome, well, now what do I do next? Who are these owners of these accounts? You don't want to shut them off, because you're constantly balancing business agility with security, because you don't want someone yelling at you. But because of the fact that we can go pull data from a request system and from log systems, I can actually take that next step of identifying orphaned accounts and then helping you propose who those owners should be for those orphaned accounts. So the concept here is I'm going to go through with a certain level of confidence to come back and say, based on usage, I can tell you that the orphaned account MKJ Beth actually belongs to Bethan. If I look at the log files, I'll see that someone else is logging in before, assuming the role of Bethan, and getting in and getting their work done. Or I can even go look at a pattern or behavior, right? So those other aspects of analytics that you can then apply and say, the Elizabeth account actually belongs to this particular user because I see them requesting it in my ITSM Remedy ServiceNow tool. And so now I can go mine that data and provide a suggestion back to the end user to see who those owners should be. All of this is actionable, right? It's not just a control that a report is derived from, but I can go back and now push the onus on this to the business owner, Elizabeth's manager, and say, if you need to approve this, and I've joined this back into that end user's account as well, all right? So the last piece of this from an analytics perspective is also looking at the operational excellence of your IGA platform. So running analytics against uptime, system health, giving excellence back to your business as to how the system is performing, if it is a cloud instance, whether the reason it wasn't being able to provision is because AWS was down or Salesforce was down, et cetera, are also some of the capabilities that you can then provide. Now, taking this one step further, you can apply analytics across the gambit of applications that we can onboard. And here at Saviynt, we don't just look at apps because we realize that as you move to the cloud, you're going to move to an application that's Office 365 or Box. And so now you've got the data element that needs to come in as well. Or you might be moving to a complete infrastructure as a service landscape where you've now got AWS and Azure that you're bringing into the fold. So first and foremost, before I go into the demo around these cloud applications, the thing to understand is that we're also providing data governance. We're also providing infrastructure governance. So from a data governance perspective, I can also tell you who has access to your Box environment. You might have a Okta or a Ping or some SSO vendor providing the SSO or the basic lifecycle management. We take it to the next level and actually provide that data element, the folders, the files that we can make requestable as well. Which now if you come back and wrap analytics around it, I can now give you analytics based on data governance. So how many people are uploading files that contain PII data? Can I get a breakdown of those violations by document, by business, all the way down to who's sharing Box links with external users and how many external users you actually have that's accessing collaboration or platforms that you're managing as well, right? So that's where now you start getting into the Box analytics. You start getting into Office 365. Look, everyone can do a single sign-on based on ADFS, federation, whatever identity provider you have, but now bringing that data element back into the warehouse, I can tell you who are your biggest violators for external shares, people that have sensitive documents that they're uploading, and classifying this back down to your governance and regulatory needs is where this becomes really important, because now your GDPR readiness initiative or your data privacy officer that wants visibility from their governance viewpoint around that data becomes much more important and valuable to them as well, okay? If you stay with the analytics around cloud, we're going to pivot from data to infrastructure, right? So everyone will provide you that SSO into the AWS console. Yes, I can even map it to a group in AD and map roles to it and give you access all the way into AWS. But what you should be concerned about in AWS, if you've read the recent leak around people not securing their S3 buckets and lots of voter data going out, and it's almost on a weekly basis now, the configuration or the DevOps management, the CI/CD process that today your DevOps users are managing isn't really being managed. All you're doing is helping with the orchestration and moving code through that CI/CD process. What we're doing is now securing that DevOps process by telling you how many instances you have that's running out there in a PCI zone that's violating those configurations because they've got an unencrypted volume, for example. If you go through the DevOps process, who made a change to that code, whether that code exists on Chef or Puppet or GitHub, that doesn't matter, right? Developers are going to use any and every type of code repo. But now those last-minute changes that are occurring in those code repos can then be enforced or remediated within the Saviynt platform as well. So I'll tell you if there's got open access on your EC2 security groups, all the way down to looking at Azure as well. So it's not just for AWS, and you will also see us coming out with support for Google Cloud Platform at the end of this year as well. But if you start looking at Chef, I can now give you that visibility into how many Chef cookbooks are out there that have global delete access, who has those chef privileges, et cetera, which makes all that boil up into a single pane of glass for your governance and IT audit teams as well. Now, one of the underlying benefits of this, of bringing usage data, is license management, right? Now I can come back and say, if I've given an E3 plan for Office 365 for end user, or an E4 plan, et cetera, I can now come back and tell you they're not using certain modules. You can reclaim licenses, and so now you can come back and provide an analytics view around it, where you provide the number of dollars you've paid per license. I can now come back and tell you, based on usage, I can reclassify how those licenses would look once you go through this process of bringing that usage data in here as well. A lot of technology vendors not happy about that, but it is the other side benefit of running this. Especially when you're in the cloud and you're paying by the drink, it becomes very important for this piece of information that you can provide back to your business as well. One thing I forgot to mention when we stay with the whole data governance as well, running those scan rules become important. Running PCI, PII scan rules, and running analytics to come back and tell you how many files do I have in my environment that are violating PII from a social security perspective. And all we're doing is running regex scans, so think of it as DLP light for the organization, and I can quickly tell you how many files within your SharePoint or Salesforce site have people uploaded files that are going to violate this PII data as well. So this entitlement, this link to the actual file, we're not bringing the file back into our warehouse, right? This is just a link to the actual file on your collaboration suite. But because I bring that element of data into our warehouse, I can now put it as an entitlement in my warehouse and put governing policies around it. I can come back and assign an owner for it. I can classify that data and then have all those analytical controls run against it as well. Think of analytics is not just the intelligence to help you with your IGA business processes, but these analytics are really helping you find that needle in the haystack where you don't know the shape, color, and size of the needle you're looking for, right? There's no such thing as out-of-the-box reports. Anyone that sold you out-of-the-box reports were selling you snake oil, because at the end of the day, you're customizing every report from every solution you've ever bought to tailor to your needs, to what you're looking for. From an analytics perspective, what we want to do is reduce the size of that haystack to show you things that you didn't know about that also exist in here as well. So whether it is running an analytics history on how many people haven't changed my password in 6 months, I shouldn't have to go to Active Directory and run a query to go get that report. That should be a control that runs as a continuous compliance monitoring control that will produce these reports, or a dashboard that says, here's your set of users that have not changed the password. This is the risk back to the organization, where you can then come back in a single pane of glass view and say, here are my users. Here's Alan Glasser. And Alan Glasser's overall risk in this scenario is made up of the outliers, because I've looked at Alan's peers. None of his peers have access to this three Active Directory groups. I can easily or quickly from here do a right-click, go create a certification campaign, so the owner of these entitlements will come back and validate whether Alan needs it. If they come back and say, yes, it's approved, whether the owner is the business or the app owner, I can now make this as an inlier recommendation to his peers, if you guys follow that, right? Similarly, from a segregation of duties perspective, it's not always about remediating SODs, it's also about assigning that mitigating control. But assigning that mitigating control should raise your overall risk. Now, when you think about how, when you leverage the analytics to get this level of data, now I can piggyback with your MFA solution and provide risk as that additional context in addition to what paying Okta, SecureAuth, and everyone else provides from an MFA perspective, which is really device or geo or IP based. I can now provide the application risk to do step-up authentication for that end user as well. Okay? And bringing in that data governance, you have that single pane of glass to show you what permissions were shared, what documents were shared, but more importantly, who were they shared with from an external perspective as well. So those identities, that the whole bring your own identity and sharing or collaborating with B2C becomes much more important. So you're making sure that you're safeguarding the files within your organization as well. Last but not least is the privileged aspect of this. So when you think about privilege governance, whether you've got a traditional PIM tool like a CyberArk or a Lieberman, et cetera, you can integrate with that to bring all those policies and govern it from here and run analytics against it. Or you can also classify certain entitlements as being privileged and then create policies back to a request or a life cycle where you can then put sunrising and sunsetting boundaries against that privilege access as well. So that brings us to about 6 minutes left. And what I'd like to do is open the floor up for any questions. Pretty cool stuff, right? Yes? I do. If you want to stop by our booth, we can share that with you. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good question because a traditional SQL database backend for IGA solutions is not going to scale with this data, right? So what you want to think about, again, we provide IGA as a cloud service. So on our back end, we're using Elasticsearch for our recon, and Hadoop is our long-term storage for all the analytics data. So if you wanted to bring in things like, it's a very good question, by the way. So if I wanted to come back and say, I would like to run a analytics for not for Docker, let's say we're using identity and access management. I want to look at all the high privileged IAM users in my dev environment for AWS, for example. I can now filter out by user. You'll get all the information as to what ARN policy from AWS was assigned, what account number of AWS account, et cetera. But whether this user was federated or whether they had a local account, we're bringing in that log data from AWS config, CloudTrail, and VPC flow logs to then come back and tell you in a forensics approach that this is the privilege audit trail for that individual. Obviously, if I start storing all this information in long-term in a SQL database, it's not going to work. And so we use Hadoop to run the analytics on the back end, and then based on customers' data retention policies, we'll get rid of it after 10 days, 20 days, as long as I have the evidence I need to effectively run that control for audit. Good question. Yes? That's a good question. So we are cloud first in the fact that we don't want you to have to go through the whole process of installing an OS app or a database, right? I think we've all lived through that pain of upgrading, and we all understand that SaaS model and how beneficial it is. With that said, we are a managed platform. You can run this in our cloud, or you can run this in yours, as long as it's got an Azure or an AWS backend, you can run this on-prem. The other option is from a deployment perspective, you can run this in our cloud and have a dedicated tenant with a VPN back to your network, where you then have the ability to pull information from your on-prem systems. And there's always the connector server option, which is having a gateway box sitting in your on-prem, doing all the provisioning and collection of data with a one-way to us in the cloud, so we can run all the analytics and provide that for you as well. Does that help? Okay. Yes?
When you consider the amount of logs for varying sizes of organizations and EPS, you're talking a boatload of data.
Yes.
Right? And so if you're feeding all this stuff across the wire, you've also got to consider cost and so on. We talked about this the other day. We talked about the other two things. So not so much of a question as much of a fear. And the amount of data you're trying to move back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage that?
Yeah. no. Yes, there is. There's looking at the volume is the first baseline, right? And especially if you are realizing that the amount of data that you're going to be leveraging, it doesn't make any sense to send across the wire, right? So now the connector server will help with parsing that, just enough information that we need. That's one option. The second option is even having your own data lake jump in as well. So you've got more and more organizations today looking at UEBA solutions like the Securonics of the world, of the Microsoft's ATA, where you've got those UEBA on-prem. Use that as your that data lake as your repository, right? So now we will provide an instance for you that may run as a managed platform on your private cloud, but uses your Hadoop backend for that long-term storage as well. So there's a couple different options on doing that.
So you're saying then you don't have to be SaaS?
It's a managed platform that for us, we can have that SaaS delivery on our cloud or have it on your prem. First and foremost, it's really the managed platform that we're trying to move organizations to, right?
It becomes an appliance.
Yeah, it becomes an appliance. Yes. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope this was informative, and please stop by our booth if you'd like a more detailed demo and discussion as well. Thank you.